All right, well, we're continuing to build out our lab, one piece at a time.
Mm-hmm.
We've got Hyper-V up and running, hopefully configured successfully and working fine, in addition to potentially having looked at the virtual labs online already and seen sort of some pieces of what we're going to be configuring in our on-premises environment. Now it's time for some software.
Mm-hmm. Yep,
beyond the Windows Server and the Hyper-V or the Windows 8 and 10 and Hyper-V that we've already used and installed and configured.
We were laughing before turning on the cameras that the title of this module, Deploying Relevant Software, is pretty broad.
It is.
But that's by design, because I honor the fact that I don't know what your use case is. You could be studying for, I just don't know what you're studying. And that's going to guide what software you download and install.
So this is Microsoft certification.
Yeah.
There's a new wrinkle to Microsoft certification in that one of our certifications accepts a Linux cert as a part of a broader Premier certification.
Right.
You may be studying for that.
That's right. I think that's Linux on Azure. Is that the one you're thinking of?
It is, and we can support that. We can support those studies.
The new Microsoft. It's really great. Let's look at our agenda. Our agenda deals with what's called OSD, Operating System Deployment, and that could be Server OS, Client OS, Linux, as we just mentioned. And then once you have your base operating system installed, it's going to be a second layer of installation fun with your server applications and client applications. This module is going to give you some good head start ideas on what you might want to consider in building out your lab. First, we have the operating system that is the heart and soul, software-wise, of your system. Your VM shell and Hyper-V is really not going to do much of anything besides sit there unless you have an operating system installed. So let's take a look at this table I put together for you. This is just something to get you started, a list of suggested operating systems that give you a nice degree of flexibility. The current standard, of course, is Windows Server 2016. And under representative use cases, there's ADDS, which is Active Directory Domain Services, Active Directory Certificate Services, CS, Active Directory Federation Services, FS, Active Directory Rights Management Services, RMS. Now say that 5 times quickly. And those are just the core Active Directory server roles. But when we think of Windows Server 2016, or when I think of it, I think of the Nano Server option, brand new, definitely covered to a very deep degree in the Server 2016 certifications. You might be wondering, why am I suggesting Windows Server 2012 R2? That's a down-level operating system. Well, first of all, you're going to see it all over the world in business. It's not in any way, shape, or form out of support or deprecated. But I also submit it's useful for doing things like trust relationships between forests and dealing with domain and forest functional levels and what features, what Active Directory features are available across different versions of Windows Server. So I submit that you may even want to go back as far as Windows Server 2008 R2. It's possible to download those ISOs just fine from the Evaluation Center. And the Linux side of the equation, it depends on your cert. Again, Christopher mentioned the Azure on Linux. There are a number of endorsed Linux distributions in Azure. Red Hat Enterprise Linux is probably one of the ones that comes to my mind first. But Red Hat Enterprise Linux is not free. You might want to consider Fedora Linux, which is a RHEL-related Linux distribution that is free. And use cases would be PowerShell on Linux. Keeping with the new Microsoft, the ability to run PowerShell on Linux is pretty amazing. The ability to do configuration management with PowerShell Desired State Configuration, DSC, Azure Automation, DSC, it's really cool. From a security standpoint, there are dedicated security distributions like Kali Linux for penetration testing. And for a desktop Linux, the one that I normally think of is Ubuntu Linux.
That's the one that comes to mind for me too when you talk about desktop.
That's a Debian Linux distribution that is intended in large part to be approachable to Linux newcomers. And also the use case there that I thought of is Bash shell familiarity. I know many administrators may shy away from PowerShell because they have had bad experiences with Linux and grep, sec, awk rather, these Linux bash commands that don't seem to have much logical rhyme or reason. Truth of the matter is it can help you go a long way with automation by knowing a bit of the bash shell. Installing server applications. Let's take a look at that next. Assuming you have Windows Server laid down in your VM, what can you do from there? Well, you may be able to answer the question directly if, for instance, you're studying for SQL Server. You know that you're going to need to install SQL Server. That's going to be our relational database use case. And SQL Server provides a back end for so many other line of business apps. Think of Skype for Business, think of SharePoint, a lot of those, and even to a lesser degree, a lot of the deployment tools. There's so many tools that rely on SQL Server as a back-end data store. SharePoint Server for collaboration, I would suggest you compare that with SharePoint Online. A big question in business, for businesses I should say, is why are you doing or why are you planning an on-premises SharePoint farm when there's SharePoint Online and Office 365 available in the Microsoft public cloud?
Well, and depending on your role, this actually brings up a good point. Depending on your role in IT currently or a role you're looking to get into in IT, this exercise right here may teach you some very valuable things. As an additional layer, if you want, if you have time and the bandwidth and the know-how, start pricing these things.
Right.
I know you're downloading and installing trials, and we're doing this all for free, and that's terrific, or again, minimal investment, if not no investment. But start comparing prices so you start getting a feel for, once you get into the real world, once you get into the enterprise, if you're already in an enterprise, you can start asking questions of cost differences. How much does it cost for me to install SharePoint on premises versus using SharePoint in the cloud per user? You know, you can find where those breakpoints are. If I have to pay for it on premises, that's a cost. If I'm paying for it in the cloud, it's per user per month over time. Where are the sweet spots and the breakpoints? It's just another exercise you can do if you're already exploring all of this software and the differences between on-premises and in the cloud. It's a worthwhile piece of information to store in your brain.
Indeed. And it brings up some related buzzwords like CapEx and OpEx. Capital expenditure, which is an upfront cost if you're doing it on premises, or OpEx, operational expenditure, for a cloud-based subscription where you're paying per month over time, as opposed to a big hit up front.
Yep.
Back to the slides, if you're doing messaging, there's Exchange Server on premises, and there's Exchange Server if you're doing messaging on premises. And I don't have the use case filled out here, but if I did, it would say Exchange Online, and asking again those same comparison contrasts between on-prem and the cloud and what's the best fit for your business. For data center server management on premises, there's the System Center suite. And there we have capabilities for mass deployment, operating system deployment, monitoring, reporting, alerting. And the analog in the cloud there would be, I would say, what's called Operations Management Suite, part of Azure, OMS. Actually, it's the next row. Oh, that's convenient, isn't it? OMS is useful in hybrid cloud management or just born in the cloud Azure management. And use cases there would be to install the OMS agent on your VMs and load them into an OMS workspace and see what kinds of things you can do. You can manage Windows Update, you can manage firewall and policy and backup and recovery. It's really cool stuff. There's free tier, by the way, available for OMS. From open source, what came to my mind off the top was Bind. I think that stands for Berkeley Internet Name, Daemon, or Domain. It's the Unix Linux DNS server. And that would be useful as an example of how to integrate a Linux DNS server with your Active Directory DNS servers. You can set up what's called a bind secondary, where a Linux machine periodically pulls a DNS zone from an Active Directory DNS server to help spread the load of DNS management. It used to be that Microsoft certification exams asked quite a bit about Bind. I'm not sure if that's the case anymore, but the more cross-platform expertise you have, it seems to me, that's all to the good in terms of building your career.
That's true.
Finally, before we do the demo, we have client applications. So we've got our operating system and our server farms, whatever those are. What about the client? Now, the client could be just Joe user or Jane user who's part of a domain and you're testing the end user experience, or it could be an administrative workstation. The suggested way to manage Microsoft stacked networks is to install, for instance, the remote server administration tools and load up your management consoles locally and not necessarily RDPing to server to server to server. So we have the System Center or OMS agent, as I've already mentioned. You could install the SQL Server client tools for DBA work or database development work. RSAT, again, stands for Remote Server Administration Tools. It's a free download that gives you your tools to manage DNS, Active Directory, DHCP, and so forth from your desktop workstation. From a developer or DevOps perspective, this is awesome, I think. The fact that Visual Studio is available in a free edition. It's called Visual Studio Community Edition. And if you're a .NET developer, you're thinking, cool, this could potentially save me a lot of money. But I dare say, even if you're a sysadmin, Visual Studio can help you a lot because you can add extensions for PowerShell script development. You can add extensions for doing Azure Resource Manager templates. Visual Studio, I think, more and more is becoming a go-to environment for any Microsoft professional, to put it that way. And the Visual Studio Code is a cross-platform code editor that, again, is equally applicable to the developer, the business analyst, the sysadmin. Webmin and PHPMyAdmin are open source tools used with Linux. Webmin is a web-based management shell, basically, for a Linux server. And MyPHPAdmin is simply a PHP website from which you can manage MySQL databases. So there you have that. Okay, in this demo, let's take a look at our laundry list of stuff we're going to do. We're going to continue the VM creation process that we started in the previous module, and then we can just basically play for a little while. That's always fun. Back to our Windows 10 desktop, back to Hyper-V Manager. We left off by creating a new VM, but we haven't actually done anything with it yet. If we right-click it and click Start, that's going to initiate a startup process, as you would expect. I'll navigate back to the Summary tab, and you can see down below a live picture of what's happening with that VM. Now, eventually, the way you manage Hyper-V VMs, in my experience, is either by using PowerShell, PowerShell Remoting, or PowerShell Direct in Windows Server 2016 and Windows 10. Or we could use RDP, Remote Desktop Protocol. If you have Hyper-V Manager, you can actually double left-click it or right-click and choose Connect to open up the virtual machine connection tool that you see here. And if you've ever installed a Windows operating system, this is the same exact deal. And again, I don't mean to be insulting anybody's intelligence here. I understand that some of you in our learner pool or learner group, whatever the term is there, may have done this so many times you're yawning, and others may be brand new. So we're trying to strike a balance here. We're being asked for a product key. Note that when you're at the evaluation center, when you download the ISO, you'll also have the opportunity to copy out the product key, your evaluation key. Make sure to do that so that you can supply it at the appropriate time when you're installing your VM. In this virtual machine connection, we can issue a Control-Alt-Delete. We can power it off. We can restart, pause, or resume the host. In the File menu, there's a Settings dialog that brings us back to the settings that we looked at earlier. The difference, of course, is because the VM's running, it's pretty much a read-only screen. As far as the virtual router, we haven't given the VIOS router much love. I've showed you how it's connected to our Hyper-V switches. But as far as giving you a leg up on getting accustomed to configuring the VIOS router, I have a cheat sheet that I created. Actually, my Pluralsight colleague Greg Shields created this and gave me permission to use it. And it's on my website. Probably can't read the address, so I'm going to mention it out loud. It's timwarnertech.com/vios.pdf, VYOS, and it's a 2-page guide for setting up the router. Now, Greg, my friend who wrote this, was doing it for a specific use case. So he goes into a little more detail than we necessarily need. Let me zoom the font up a little bit. What I want to draw your attention to is when you start your VIOS VM for the first time, remember that you've attached it to the virtual switches. It has two network interfaces, one connected to each switch. You've linked the ISO image file to the VM and you start it up. It's going to ask you to log in and ask you what you want to do next. Install image is the command that you use to actually install VIOS as a permanent VM. The power off command comes directly from Linux. That's how you would power it down. To configure your virtual interfaces in VIOS, you enter configuration mode by using, you guessed it, the configure command. And that puts you into a global configuration mode that's very much like the Cisco router and switch configuration mode. And then we can do set interfaces, Ethernet, ETH0 address, IP address / subnet mask, and do the same thing for ETH1. Now you're going to want to know which of those interfaces corresponds to which Hyper-V switch. And the way that you can do that is to do a show interfaces in the router. So I'm going to bring up the router for a moment in its own little window. And if you do a show configuration, I actually did this in the previous demo. Let me see if I can do a zoom it again. Yep. Show configuration lets us know that my ETH0 has a hardware ID that ends with 02, and my ETH1 interface has a hardware address that ends in 05. So that means we can cross-check that in the settings for the virtual machine by, again, going to each network adapter, going under Advanced Features, and verifying it. So my .10 network adapter is bound to the 02 or ETH0 interface, and my other network adapter that's linked to the .20 switch, that is the one with the 05 MAC address, and that corresponds to ETH1 on the virtual network. You see? The good news here is that this tedium is a one-shot deal. Once you configure the router, it's going to maintain its configuration. Yep. Back to the PDF, the set interfaces gives the IP address to each interface. And then Greg goes into more details here with RIP, routing protocol, and network address translation that we don't need to worry about for our purposes, but these last two bullet points are absolutely crucial. After you finish setting your IP addresses in VIOS, you have to type commit to save your configuration changes, and then don't forget to hit save, to type save and press enter to commit your changes to the virtual hard disk. Otherwise, you'll find that when you power down or restart, you'll be like, what happened to my interface?
You'll get to go through all of that again.
You'll have to do some repetition, which as an instructor, I'm a believer in repetition. I think it's key to adult education, but after you do it a few times, you'll want to find a way to not have to do it again.
Well, and after you do it a few times, you'll remember every time from then on to make sure you commit and save those changes.
Mm-hmm. That's certainly
not that
true.
I have any experience of having accidentally changed something and not committed changes and then tried to figure out why it didn't work.
Right. Yep. So once you have the OS installed, it's a question of just logging into the virtual machine and deploying any additional software that you may need to. So my DC1 domain controller, the reason it's a domain controller is because I installed Active Directory Domain Services. So let me maximize this. And this is a full screen view of the VM. You wouldn't know that it's any different from my hardware host. It behaves exactly like any other machine. If I right-click the Start button and go to Run and type ncpa.cpl, that's a really cool shortcut to know about. ncpa.cpl. And what that does, it shortcuts to the Network Connections control panel. And so we have an Ethernet interface here that if I right-click and go to Properties, we can configure this exactly like we can a real physical interface on a server. And in order to complete the networking configuration, you'll notice that I've had to hand type, because this is a statically assigned Windows server. I've given it the IP address of 172.16.10.10 with a 24-bit mask, and I need that gateway address, 172.16.10.1. That's the interface of the Vios router, and I'm looking to the local host for DNS, because this is a DNS server. And the way we can test the configuration from within the VM is we can right-click the PowerShell icon and select Run as Administrator to open up an elevated PowerShell prompt. And we could use the PowerShell commandlet test connection, but I've used ping for so long. Sometimes you'll find that Windows will default to IPv6, so I habitually add the for flag to choose IPv4. And we can test our connection to the local machine, which is 1010. Of course, I have to type it correctly. Let me Control-C, up arrow, and make that 10.10. That's going to verify my own connectivity. I'm going to type CLS to clear the screen, up arrow, and now let me up arrow a couple times actually. Let's see if we can reach the near side router interface, 10.1. That's our Vios router. We can. We know the other Vios address, the other side, which is 172.16.20.1. That's coming back positively, so we've got connectivity to another network. And finally, we can go to a host on the remote network. I have a virtual machine called Mem1 that is at 20.10. And see, this is a good troubleshooting case. It's saying destination host unreachable. Now, what could that mean? It could mean a number of things. Let me close out of this connection, and sure enough, we see the answer right here. Mem1 is turned off, so of course it's not going to be available on 10.1, 10.10 rather. So I hope this made some semblance of sense. At this point, once you have your networking and OS is laid down, you have full connectivity, you've got routed interconnectivity. Some homework assignments for you to look up and do is go to the Vios website. They have an excellent user manual. Figure out how you can allow DHCP traffic through the router. Of course, a router is going to drop broadcast traffic by default. That's how routers behave. But you may want to have your Mem1 machine as a DHCP server. And well, actually, you'd want your DC1 to be the DHCP server, and then see if your client machine on the other subnet can pick up an address from the DHCP server. You're going to need to execute a command or two on your Vios router to allow the forwarding of those DHCP or BootP frames. Let's wrap this up and look at the lessons we've learned over the course of this module. Your lab should be as flexible as possible. Because there's some upfront work involved, as we saw, there's an initial time investment. I would say that before too long in your work, you're going to long for easy lab reset. You're not going to necessarily want to invest a couple hours every time you need to refresh the lab or modify it slightly.
Do you have any tools for that?
There actually are several tools for that.
Strange.
Just coincidentally enough, we do have some tools for that. And again, by a tremendous coincidence, our next module is called, can you believe this? Planning for Lab Reuse.
Who knew?
Who knew? So we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.